Gandalf.
Gandalf/ɡændɑːlf/ is a fictional character in J.R.R. Tolkien's novels The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He is a wizard, member of the Istari Order, as well as leader of the Fellowship of the Ring and the Army of the West. In The Lord of the Rings, he is initially known as Gandalf the Grey, but returns from death as Gandalf the White.
Characteristics.
Tolkien discusses Gandalf in his essay on the Istari, which appears in the work Unfinished Tales. He describes Gandalf as the last of the wizards to appear in Middle-earth, one who seemed the least, less tall than the others, and in looks more aged, grey-haired and grey-clad, and leaning on a staff. Yet the elf Círdan who met him on arrival nevertheless considered him the greatest spirit and the wisest, and gave him the elven ring of power called gnænda'lf, the ring of fire, containing a red stone for his aid and comfort. Tolkien explicitly links Gandalf to the element fire later in the same essay.
Biography. Valinor.
In Valinor, Gandalf was known as Olorin. As recounted in the Valaquenta in the Silmarillion, he was one of the Maor of Valinor, specifically, of the people of the Valar Mani, and was said to be the wisest of the Maor. He lived in the gardens of Urmo under the tutelage of Nienna, the patron of mercy. When the Valar decided to send the Order of the Wizards to Middle-earth in order to counsel and assist all those who opposed Sauron, Olorin was proposed by Mani. Olorin initially begged to be excused as he feared Sauron and lacked the strength to face him, but Mani replied that that was all the more reason for him to go. As one of the Maor, Gandalf was not a mortal man but an angelic being who had descended into human form. As one of the angelic Maor spirits, Olorin was in service to the Creator, Eru Iluvatar, and the Creator's secret fire. Along with the other Maor who entered into the world as the Five Wizards, he took on the specific form of an aged old man as a sign of his humility. The role of the wizards was to advise and counsel but never to attempt to match Sauron's strength with his own, and hopefully the kings and lords of Middle-earth would be more receptive to the advice of a humble old man than a more glorious form giving them direct commands.
Middle-earth.
Gandalf the Grey was the last of the Istari landing in Mithlond. He seemed the oldest and least in stature of them, but Círdan the shipwright felt that he had the highest inner greatness on their first meeting in the Havens, and gave him gnænda'lf, the ring of fire. Saruman later learned of the gift and resented it. Gandalf hid the ring well, and it was not widely known until he left with the other ring-bearers at the end of the Third Age that he, and not Círdan, was the holder of the third of the Elven Rings. Gandalf's relationship with Saruman, the head of the Order, was strained. The wizards were commanded to aid men, elves, and dwarves, but only through counsel. It was forbidden to use force to dominate them, an injunction that Saruman disregarded.
The White Council.
In Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, in the Silmarillion, and the Istari, in Unfinished Tales, Tolkien fleshes out the background and the history briefly tabulated by date in Appendix B of The Lord of the Rings. Gandalf suspected early on that the necromancer of Dol Guldur was not a Nazgul but Sauron himself. He went to Dol Guldur, in TA 2063, to discover the truth, but the necromancer withdrew before him. The necromancer returned to Dol Guldur with greater force in TA 2460, and the White Council was formed in response, TA 2463. Galadriel had hoped Gandalf would lead the council, but Gandalf refused, declining to be bound by any but the Valar who sent him. Saruman was chosen instead, as being most knowledgeable about Sauron's work in the Second Age. Gandalf returned to Dol Guldur in TA 2850 at great peril, and learned that the necromancer was indeed Sauron returned. This is when Gandalf found Thrain II imprisoned in Dol Guldur and recovered Thra's map and the key to Erebor before Thrain died. The following year the White Council was summoned, and Gandalf urged that Sauron be driven out. Saruman, however, reassured the council that Sauron's evident effort to find the One Ring, a necessary component of his resurgence, would fail, as the ring would long since have been carried by the river Anduin into the sea. And the matter was allowed to rest. but at this time Saruman himself began actively seeking the ring near the Gladden fields where Isildur had been killed, not far from Dol Guldur.
The Quest of Erebor.
The Quest of Erebor, an unfinished tales, elaborates upon the story behind The Hobbit. It tells of a chance meeting between Gandalf and Thorin Oakenshield, a dwarf king in exile, in the Inn of the Prancing Pony in Bree. Gandalf had for some time foreseen the coming war with Sauron, and knew that the north was especially vulnerable. If Rivendell were to be attacked, the dragon's smoke could cause great devastation. He persuaded Thorin that he could help him regain his lost territory of Erebor from Smaug, and so the quest was born. In TA 2941, Gandalf arranged, and frequently accompanied, a band of 13 dwarves and the hobbit Bilbo Baggins to reclaim from Smaug the dwarves' lost treasure in Erebor. To the quest, Gandalf contributed a map and key to Erebor. It was on this quest of Erebor that Gandalf found his sword, Glamdring, in a troll's treasure hoard. After escaping from the Misty Mountains pursued by goblins and wargs, the party was carried to safety by the Great Eagles. Gandalf then persuaded Beorn, who did not like uninvited guests or dwarves, to house and provision the company for the trip through Mirkwood. Gandalf left the company before they entered Mirkwood, saying that he had pressing business to attend to. He turned up again, however, before the walls of Erebor disguised as an old man, revealing himself when it seemed the men of Egaroth and the Mirkwood elves would fight Thorin and the dwarves over Smaug's treasure. The Battle of the Five Armies ensued when hosts of goblins and wargs attacked all three parties. After the battle, Gandalf accompanied Bilbo back to the Shire, revealing at Rivendell what his pressing business had been. Gandalf had once again urged the council to evict Sauron, since quite evidently Sauron did not require the One Ring to continue to attract evil to Mirkwood. Then, in an event only briefly described, in the Silmarillion, The Hobbit, and The Lord of the Rings, the council put forth its power, and drove Sauron from Dol Guldur. Sauron, however, had anticipated this and withdrew as a feint, only to reappear in Mordor.
Prelude to the War of the Ring.
As explained in The Fellowship of the Ring, Gandalf spent the years between The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings traveling Middle-earth in search of information on Sauron's resurgence and Bilbo's mysterious ring, spurred particularly by Bilbo's initial misleading story of how he had obtained it as a present from Gollum. During this period he befriended Aragorn and first became suspicious of Saruman. He spent as much time as he could in the Shire, strengthening his friendship with Bilbo and Frodo, Bilbo's heir. He returned to the Shire for Bilbo's 111th birthday party in TA 3001, bringing many fireworks for the occasion. After Bilbo, as a prank on his guests, put on the ring and disappeared, Gandalf strongly encouraged his old friend to leave the ring to Frodo, as they had planned. Bilbo became hostile and accused Gandalf of trying to steal the ring, which he called my precious, much as Gollum had done. Isildur, who earlier possessed the ring and was destroyed by it, had written that it is precious to me. Alarmed, Gandalf impressed on Bilbo the foolishness of this accusation. Coming to his senses, Bilbo admitted that the ring had been troubling him, and leaving it behind for Frodo, he departed for Rivendell. Though Bilbo would never be entirely free of the desire for the ring, he was the first of its bearers to give it up willingly. Over the next 17 years, Gandalf travelled extensively, searching for answers. With Aragorn he sought to find Gollum. Aragorn eventually succeeded, and Gandalf questioned Gollum, threatening him with fire when he proved unwilling to speak. Gandalf learned finally that Sauron had forced Gollum under torture in Barad-dûr to tell what he knew of the ring. This reinforced Gandalf's growing suspicion that Bilbo's ring was the One Ring.
The Fellowship of the Ring.
Returning to the Shire, in TA 3018, Gandalf confirmed his suspicions by throwing the ring into Frodo's hearthfire and reading the writing that appeared on the ring's surface. He told Frodo the full history of the ring, and urged him to take the ring to Rivendell. For he would be in grave danger if he stayed in the Shire. Gandalf said he would attempt to return for Frodo's 50th birthday party, in order to accompany him on the road thereafter. And that meanwhile Frodo should arrange to leave quietly, as the servants of Sauron would be searching for him. Outside the Shire, Gandalf encountered Radagast the Brown, another of the Istari, who brought the news that the Nazgul had ridden forth and crossed the River Anduin, and a request from Saruman that Gandalf come to Isengard. Gandalf left a letter to Frodo, urging his immediate departure, with Barlam and Butterbur at the inn in Bree, and headed towards Isengard. There Saruman revealed his true colours, urging Gandalf to help him obtain the ring for his own use. Gandalf refused, and Saruman imprisoned him at the top of the Tower of Orthanc. Eventually Gandalf was rescued by Gwaihir the Eagle. Gwaihir set Gandalf down in Rohan, where Gandalf appealed to King Theoden for a horse. Theoden, under the malign influence of Grima Wormtongue, Saruman's spy, told Gandalf to take any horse he pleased, but to leave quickly. It was then that Gandalf met the great horse Shadowfax, one of the Miaras, who would be his mount and companion for most of the rest of the war. Gandalf pursued the horse for 2 days before Shadowfax permitted Gandalf to ride him. Gandalf then rode hard for the Shire, but did not reach it until Frodo had already set out. Knowing that Frodo and his companions would be heading for Rivendell, Gandalf began to make his own way there. He learned at Bree that the hobbits had fallen in with Aragorn. He faced the Nazgul at Weathertop but escaped after an all-night battle, drawing 4 of them northward. Frodo, Aragorn and company faced the remaining 5 on Weathertop a few nights later. Gandalf reached Rivendell just before Frodo's arrival. In Rivendell, Gandalf helped Elrond drive off the Nazgul pursuing Frodo and played a great part in the following council as the only person who knew the full history of the ring. He also revealed that Saruman had betrayed them and was in league with Sauron. When it was decided that the ring had to be destroyed, Gandalf volunteered to accompany Frodo, now the ring-bearer, in his quest. He also persuaded Elrond to let Frodo's cousins Merry and Pippin join the Fellowship. Taking charge of the Fellowship, comprising 9 representatives of the free peoples of Middle-earth, set against the 9 riders, Gandalf and Aragorn led the hobbits and their companions south. After an unsuccessful attempt to cross Mount Caragors in winter, they crossed under the mountains through the mines of Moria, though only Gimli the dwarf was enthusiastic about that route. In Moria, they discovered that the dwarf colony established there earlier had been overrun by orcs. The Fellowship fought with the orcs and trolls of Moria, but were no match for Durin's Bane, a Balrog from ancient times. At the bridge of Khazad Dûm, Gandalf faced the Balrog to enable the others to escape. After a short exchange of blows, Gandalf broke the bridge beneath the Balrog with his staff. As the Balrog fell, it wrapped its whip around Gandalf's knees, dragging him into the abyss. As his friends looked on in horror, Gandalf fell into the pit, crying "Fly, you fools!" as he went. Gandalf and the Balrog fell into the deep subterranean lake under Moria. Gandalf pursued the Balrog for 8 days until they climbed to the peak of Zyarek-Zigil. Here they fought for 2 days and nights. In the end, the Balrog was cast down and broke the mountainside with its fall. Gandalf himself died during this ordeal, and his body lay on the peak while his spirit travelled out of thought and time.
Gandalf the White.
Gandalf was sent back as Gandalf the White, and returned to life on the mountain. Gwaihir, Lord of Eagles, carried him to Lorien, where he was healed of his injuries and reclothed in white robes by Galadriel. He travelled to Fangorn Forest, where he encountered Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas, who were tracking Merry and Pippin. They mistook him for Saruman, but he stopped their attacks and revealed himself. They travelled to Rohan, where Gandalf found that Theoden had been further weakened by Wormtongue's influence. He broke Wormtongue's hold over Theoden, and convinced the king to join in the fight against Sauron. Gandalf then set off to gather Erkinbrand of the Westfold and his warriors to assist Theoden in the coming battle with Saruman. Gandalf arrived just in time to shatter Saruman's attack on Helm's Deep. After the ensuing battle, Gandalf and the king rode to Isengard, which in the interim had itself been attacked and conquered by Treebeard and the Ents, along with Merry and Pippin. Gandalf broke Saruman's staff and expelled him from the White Council and the Order of Wizards, and assumed Saruman's place as head of both. Wormtongue made an indecisive attempt to kill Gandalf or Saruman with the Palantir of Orthanc, but missed both. Pippin retrieved the palantir, but Gandalf quickly appropriated it. After the group left Isengard, Pippin took the palantir from a sleeping Gandalf, looked into it, and came face to face with Sauron himself. Gandalf then took the chase and Pippin with him to Minas Tirith to keep the young hobbit out of further trouble. Gandalf arrived in time to help order the defences of Minas Tirith. His presence was resented by Denethor, the steward of Gondor. But after Denethor's son Faramir was gravely wounded in battle, Denethor sank into despair and madness. Together with Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, Gandalf led the defenders during the siege of the city. When the forces of Mordor finally broke the main gate, Gandalf alone on Shadowfax confronted the Witch King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul. But at that moment the Rohirrim arrived, compelling the Witch King to withdraw and engage them. Gandalf would have ridden to their aid, but he too was suddenly required elsewhere, to save Faramir from Denethor, who sought in desperation to burn himself and his son on a funeral pyre in Raftin. Aragorn and Gandalf then led the final campaign against Sauron's forces at the Black Gate, in an effort to distract the Dark Lord's attention from Frodo Baggins and Sam Gamgee, who were at the same moment scaling Mount Doom to destroy the One Ring. In a parley before the battle, Gandalf and the other leaders of the West met the mouth of Sauron, who showed them Frodo's mithril shirt and other items from the Hobbit's equipment. But Gandalf rejected Mordor's terms of surrender, and the forces of the West faced the full might of Sauron's armies, until the ring was destroyed in Ur-Druin. Gandalf led the Eagles to rescue Frodo and Sam from the erupting Ur-Druin. After the war, Gandalf crowned Aragorn as King Elessar, and helped him find a sapling of the White Tree of Gondor. He accompanied the hobbits back to the borders of the Shire, before leaving to visit Tom Bombadil. 2 years later, Gandalf, who by now had spent about 2,000 years in Middle-earth, departed with Frodo, Bilbo, Galadriel, and Elrond across the sea to the Undying Lands. It was only then that his possession of Narya, one of the 3 elven rings, became generally known.
Concept and creation.
Humphrey Carpenter in his 1977 biography relates that Tolkien owned a postcard entitled Der Berggeist, German, The Mountain Spirit, and on the paper cover in which he kept it, he wrote the origin of Gandalf. The postcard reproduces a painting of a bearded figure, sitting on a rock under a pine tree in a mountainous setting. He wears a wide-brimmed round hat and a long red cloak, and a white fawn is nuzzling his upturned hands. Carpenter said that Tolkien recalled buying the postcard during his holiday in Switzerland in 1911. Manfred Zimmermann, however, discovered that the painting was by German artist Joseph Madlener and dates to the mid-1920s. Carpenter acknowledged that Tolkien was probably mistaken about the origin of the postcard. The original painting was auctioned at Sotheby's in London on July 12, 2005 for PS $84,000. The previous owner had been given the painting by Madlener in the 1940s and recalled that Madlener said the mountains in the background were the Torre del Violet, peaks of Dolomites. When writing The Hobbit in the early 1930s, Tolkien gave the name Gandalf to the leader of the dwarves, the character later called Thorin Oakenshield. The name is taken from the same source as all the other dwarf names, save Balin, in The Hobbit, the catalogue of dwarves in the Völuspá. The Old Norse name Gandalf incorporates the words Gand meaning wand, staff, or, especially in compounds, magic, and alf or elf. The name Gandalf is found in at least one more place in Norse myth, in the semi-historical Heimskringla, which briefly describes Gandalf Alfgusson, a legendary Norse king from eastern Norway and rival of Halfdan the Black. The name Gandalf occurs as a character in William Morris' 1896 fantasy novel The Well at the World's End. Morris' book is a multi-part magical journey involving elves, dwarves and kings in a pseudo-medieval landscape which is known to have deeply influenced Tolkien. The wizard that became Gandalf was originally named Blodorthin. Tolkien later assigned this name to an ancient king who had ordered some spears from the dwarves. Tolkien came to regret his ad hoc use of Old Norse name, referring to a rabble of Eddaic-named dwarves. Invented in an idle hour in 1937. But the decision to use Old Norse names came to have far-reaching consequences in the composition of The Lord of the Rings. In 1942, Tolkien decided that the work was to be a purported translation from the fictional language of Westron, and in the English translation Old Norse names were taken to represent names in the language of Dale. Gandalf, in this setting, is thus a representation in English, anglicized from Old Norse, of the name the dwarves of Dale had given to Oloran in the language they used externally in their daily affairs, while Tharkun is the, untranslated, name, presumably of the same meaning, that the dwarves gave him in their native Custhialt language. Tolkien explains this in his Guide to the Names in The Lord of the Rings, 1967, to prospective translators. Throughout the early drafts, and through to the first edition of The Hobbit Blood Orthin, Gandalf is described as being a little old man, distinct from a dwarf, but not of the full human stature that would later be described in The Lord of the Rings. Even in The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf was not tall. Shorter, for example, than Elrond or the other wizards. Gandalf's role and importance was substantially increased in the conception of The Lord of the Rings, and in a letter of 1954, Tolkien refers to Gandalf as an angel incarnate. In the same letter Tolkien states he was given the form of an old man in order to limit his powers on Earth. Both in 1965 and 1971 Tolkien again refers to Gandalf as an angelic being. In a letter of 1946 Tolkien stated that he thought of Gandalf as an Edenic wanderer. Other commentators have also compared Gandalf to the Norse god Odin in his wanderer guise, an old man with one eye, a long white beard, a wide-brimmed hat, and a staff.
Adaptations.
In the BBC radio dramatisations, Gandalf has been voiced by Norman Shelley in The Lord of the Rings, 1955–1956, Heron Carvick in The Hobbit, 1968, Bernard Mays in The Lord of the Rings, 1979, and Sir Michael Hordern in The Lord of the Rings, 1981. John Huston voiced Gandalf in the animated films The Hobbit, 1977, and The Return of the King, 1980, produced by Rankin Bass. William Squire voiced Gandalf in the animated film The Lord of the Rings, 1978, directed by Ralph Bakshi. Gandalf was portrayed by Vesa Virikko in the Finnish television miniseries Hobbit, 1993. Sir Ian McKellen portrayed Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, 2001–2003, directed by Peter Jackson, though Sean Connery was also offered the role and McKellen had never read any of Tolkien's works. The makeup and costumes were based on designs by John Howe and Alan Lee. According to Jackson, McKellen impersonated Tolkien in the role. For the first film, McKellen was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. He reprised his role in the 2012 film The Hobbit, An Unexpected Journey and its 2013 sequel The Hobbit, The Desolation of Smaug, and will portray the character in the remaining sequel The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies. Charles Picard portrayed Gandalf in the 1999 stage production of The Two Towers at Chicago's Lifeline Theatre. Tom Stryver portrayed Gandalf in the early 2000s stage productions of The Fellowship of the Ring, The Two Towers and The Return of the King for Clear Stage Cincinnati. Brent Carver portrayed Gandalf in the 2006 musical production The Lord of the Rings, which opened in Toronto. Gandalf appears in the Lego Movie voiced by Todd Hanson. He is among the master builders in Meeting Cloud Cuckoo Land. It was also known that Vitruvius often mixes him up with Albus Dumbledore, much to the chagrin of the two wizards. Gandalf is also a playable character in the Lego Movie video game. In story mode, he and a magician help Emmett fight Lord Business Giant Robot by providing his construction mech with debris to throw at it.
Reception and legacy.
Gandalf was chosen by Mary Hoffman as one of her favorite fictional characters, saying he was the best white wizard in fiction. Ian McKellen has received widespread acclaim for his performance as Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings film series, particularly in The Fellowship of the Ring, for which he received both a Screen Actors Guild Award and Saturn Award for Best Supporting Actor, and an Academy Award nomination under the same category, making him the only individual cast member of the films to be nominated for an Oscar. In addition, Empire named Gandalf, as portrayed by McKellen, the 28th greatest film character of all time. Gandalf's name is occasionally used allusively to indicate a wise mentor or wizard-like advisor. For example, British politician Oliver Letwin has been called the Gandalf of the process of policy formation for the Conservative Party under David Cameron.